The maid never imagined that her simple gesture could bring hope back to the handsome, sick millionaire whom everyone had rejected. If you enjoy love and romance stories, subscribe to this channel, leave your comment. Every day we post videos like this. Continuing. He had always been the man everyone admired. Alexander Hartwell, at 32, was everything London's elite aspired to be: devastatingly handsome, brilliantly sharp, and impossibly successful. His tech company, Neural Dynamics, had revolutionized artificial intelligence applications in healthcare, making him not just wealthy, but genuinely important. His face graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, his opinions shaped policy discussions at Westminster, and his future seemed as limitless as his ambition. Alexander lived in a world where everything was measured, calculated, and controlled. His penthouse apartment in Canary Wharf overlooked the Thames, a daily reminder of how far he'd climbed from his modest beginnings in Manchester. Board meetings, charity galas, and exclusive dinners filled his calendar. Politicians sought his counsel, investors competed for his attention, and women found excuses to brush against his arm at cocktail parties. He had built his identity on being untouchable, unreachable, superior. The boy who had once worn second-hand school uniforms had transformed into a man who wore bespoke Savile Row suits without thinking twice about the cost. Every morning, he would stand at his floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the city below like a king surveying his kingdom. And in many ways he was. His relationship with Victoria Sinclair epitomized this perfectly crafted existence. She was everything that complemented his image: aristocratic, beautiful, cultured, and completely in sync with his world. The daughter of a prominent banker, Victoria moved through their social circles with the practiced grace of someone born to privilege. Their engagement had been featured in Tatler. Their wedding was planned for the following spring at her family's estate in the Cotswolds, and their future together seemed as predetermined as a mathematical equation. That Tuesday evening in November started like any other. Alexander had just closed a major deal with a pharmaceutical giant, securing funding that would expand Neural Dynamics into 3 new countries. The celebration dinner at the Shard had been flawless, with champagne flowing and congratulations echoing from every corner of their private dining room. Victoria had looked radiant in her emerald dress, her laugh ringing out at all the right moments, her hand resting possessively on his arm. He remembered driving her home to her Kensington flat, the city lights blurring past the windows of his Aston Martin. They had talked about moving the wedding forward, about the house they would buy in Surrey, about the children they would have. Everything was falling into place with the precision he had always demanded from life. Victoria had kissed him good night at her door, her lips tasting of champagne and promises, her eyes bright with shared dreams. The drive back to Canary Wharf should have taken 25 minutes. Alexander knew every shortcut, every light pattern, every curve of the route. But that night, as rain began to fall and the streets grew slick, his phone rang with news that another tech startup was trying to poach one of his key developers. The conversation grew heated, his attention divided between the road and his anger at corporate betrayal. He never saw the lorry running the red light. The impact happened so fast that his mind couldn't process it. One moment he was accelerating through an intersection, victory still sweet on his tongue, and the next, the world was spinning, glass exploding, metal screaming against metal. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a symphony of destruction that seemed to go on forever and end in an instant. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. The antiseptic smell of hospital, the steady beeping of machines, the soft murmur of voices speaking in medical terms he didn't understand. His throat felt raw, his head pounded, and there was a strange, terrifying absence where sensation should have been. Dr. Patricia Chen was the one to deliver the news. She was kind but direct, her words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything. The spinal cord injury was complete, T12 vertebra. The technical terms meant nothing to him at first, but their translation was devastating. He would never walk again. Alexander's first response was denial, then bargaining, then a rage so pure and consuming that it surprised even him. He was Alexander Hartwell. He made impossible things happen. He solved problems that others couldn't even comprehend. This was simply another challenge to overcome, another obstacle to demolish through sheer will and unlimited resources. The months that followed became a blur of desperate hope and crushing disappointment. He flew to Switzerland, Germany, the United States, seeking experimental treatments, stem cell therapy, neural implants, cutting-edge rehabilitation programs that cost more than most people's houses. He threw millions at the problem, assembling teams of the world's best specialists, but their cautious optimism always ended in the same gentle, devastating conclusion. The damage was irreversible. The wheelchair became more than medical equipment. It became a symbol of everything he had lost. Every mirror reflected a man he didn't recognize. Every doorway reminded him of his limitations. Every sympathetic glance from former colleagues felt like pity for a fallen giant. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now struggled with curbs. The hands that had signed multi-million-pound deals now gripped rubber wheels. Victoria genuinely tried to maintain their relationship. She visited daily at first, bringing flowers and magazines, chattering about mutual friends and social events as if nothing had changed. But Alexander could see the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, the mixture of grief and revulsion she couldn't quite hide. Their conversations grew stilted, their silences stretched longer, and the physical intimacy that had once been effortless became awkward and forced. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, exactly 4 months after the accident. Victoria sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair she had occupied so many times before, her hands folded in her lap, her engagement ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. She spoke carefully, as if she had rehearsed the words. "I can't do this anymore, Alex," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could, but I can't. You're not the man I fell in love with. That man was confident, ambitious, alive. Now you're just angry, all the time. At everyone. At me." He wanted to fight, to argue, to win her back with the same determination that had built his empire. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Then leave." She did. The next morning, her things were gone from his penthouse, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the engagement ring on his bedside table. His business partners showed more loyalty than his fiancée, but not much. Marcus Webb and James Fitzgerald had been his closest allies, the three of them building Neural Dynamics from a shared flat in Shoreditch to a company worth hundreds of millions. They visited regularly at first, bringing reports and asking for his input on major decisions. But as weeks turned to months, their visits became less frequent, their deference more forced. The final board meeting he attended in person was a disaster. Wheeled into the conference room, where he had once commanded absolute respect, Alexander found himself at eye level with everyone's belts and handbags. His suggestions were listened to politely, but dismissed subtly. When he lost his temper over a strategic decision he disagreed with, the uncomfortable silence that followed made it clear that his authority was now ceremonial at best. "Perhaps it would be better if you focused on your recovery," Marcus had suggested gently after the meeting. "We can handle the day-to-day operations." It was a kind way of saying he was no longer necessary. His parents, Harold and Margaret Hartwell, tried to bridge the growing chasm between their son and the world. They drove down from Manchester every weekend, his mother bringing homemade meals he barely touched, his father attempting to discuss business and politics as if nothing had changed. But Alexander could see the fear in their eyes, the bewilderment at what their successful son had become. "You're still our boy," his mother would say, tears threatening her composure. "You're still brilliant, still capable of amazing things." But Alexander no longer believed in amazing things. He believed in limitations, in loss, in the cruel arithmetic of before and after. 6 months after the accident, he made a decision that surprised even him. He would go home, not to recover, not to regroup, but to retreat. He dismissed the staff at his penthouse, replacing them with people who didn't know Alexander Hartwell before the wheelchair, people who had no memory of the man he used to be. He wanted anonymity in his own life, the freedom to be bitter without disappointing anyone's expectations. The new staff was efficient but distant, exactly what he thought he wanted. They came, did their jobs, and left without trying to engage him in conversation or offer unwanted sympathy. For the first time since the accident, Alexander felt like he could breathe without performing courage he didn't feel. It was into this carefully constructed isolation that Grace arrived on a grey Monday morning in early spring, carrying a battered leather bag and wearing the kind of practical coat that suggested a woman who valued function over fashion. She was perhaps 45, with greying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and hands that showed years of honest work. There was something different about her from the moment she walked in, a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with status or wealth and everything to do with character. Alexander barely looked up from his laptop when she introduced herself. Another housekeeper, another face he would try not to learn, another person to keep at a safe distance. He mumbled something about her duties and expectations, his tone making it clear that he had no interest in conversation. But as Grace began to work, something unexpected happened. She didn't try to cheer him up or offer false optimism. She didn't ask about his accident or express sympathy for his situation. She simply did her job with a quiet competence that somehow made the house feel different, less like a mausoleum and more like a place where someone actually lived. And for the first time in months, Alexander found himself curious about another person. Grace Murphy had been cleaning houses for the better part of 15 years, and she could read a home's emotional temperature within minutes of walking through the door. This penthouse in Canary Wharf was different from the others, not because of its obvious wealth or stunning views, but because of the suffocating weight of despair that seemed to press against every surface. The previous housekeeper had lasted only 3 weeks before requesting a transfer, citing the employer as impossible to please. The one before that had quit after 5 days, leaving behind only a terse note about hostile working conditions. Grace had heard the warnings, seen the concern in the agency coordinator's eyes, but she had also seen the generous salary and the flexible hours that would allow her to visit her son David on weekends. She had taken the position through an agency that specialized in discretion. Alexander Hartwell's reputation preceded him, of course. Even someone like Grace, who paid little attention to business news, knew the basic story. The brilliant entrepreneur, the devastating accident, the dramatic fall from grace. What the newspapers couldn't convey was the palpable anger that radiated from him like heat from a furnace, or the way he seemed determined to push away anyone who dared to show him kindness. On her first morning, Grace had arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, as instructed. The apartment was immaculate in the way that only unlived-in spaces can be. Every surface gleamed, every object was perfectly placed, but there was no warmth, no sense that this was a home rather than a showroom. Alexander was in his study, staring at 3 computer monitors with the intensity of a man trying to solve the world's most complex equation. He barely acknowledged her presence, responding to her polite greeting with a grunt that might have been dismissive or might have been acknowledgement. "The cleaning supplies are in the utility room," he said without looking up. "I don't want to be disturbed between 9 and noon. The kitchen doesn't need much attention since I rarely use it, and please don't move anything in my study. Everything has its place." His tone was clipped, professional, designed to establish distance and hierarchy. Grace simply nodded, noting the barely touched coffee cup beside his keyboard and the stack of unopened mail on the desk. She had worked for difficult clients before, men and women who wore their wealth like armor and their problems like excuses. But there was something different about Alexander's hostility. It felt less like arrogance and more like protection, as if he were a wounded animal that had learned to bare its teeth at any approach. Over the next few days, Grace developed a routine that worked around Alexander's schedule and moods. She arrived early, when he was still in his bedroom, and worked quietly through the main areas of the apartment. She learned to read the signs of his bad days by the volume of his voice during phone calls, the way he gripped his wheelchair wheels when navigating between rooms, the sharp edge to his instructions when he needed something. He wasn't cruel exactly, but he was indifferent in a way that felt almost worse than outright hostility. He would ask for his lunch without saying please, point out missed spots on surfaces she had already cleaned twice, and conduct phone conversations as if she were invisible. When she brought him tea or coffee, he would take it without looking up, without acknowledgement, as if the cup had simply materialized through force of will. But Grace had raised a disabled son, and she understood the difference between malice and pain. David had been born with cerebral palsy, and during his difficult teenage years, he had lashed out at everyone who tried to help him, furious at a world that seemed designed to exclude him. She had learned then that sometimes the people who need kindness most are the ones who seem to want it least, so she began leaving small notes around the apartment, nothing presumptuous or overly familiar, just brief observations or gentle reminders. Beautiful sunrise this morning, tucked under his coffee cup. Rain expected this afternoon, left on his desk beside his jacket. Your mother called while you were in the shower. written in her careful script and placed where he would see it. Alexander never acknowledged these notes directly, but she noticed he didn't throw them away immediately. Sometimes she would find them days later, folded and placed in drawers or between the pages of books, as if he couldn't bear to keep them, but couldn't quite bring himself to discard them either. The first real crack in his defensive wall came during her second week of employment. Grace had been dusting the bookshelves in his study when she came across a collection of physics texts, their pages worn and margins filled with notes in Alexander's precise handwriting. Without thinking, she had commented, "My son loves physics, always trying to explain quantum mechanics to me over Sunday dinner." Alexander looked up from his computer for the first time since she had started working for him. "Your son?" "David," Grace said simply. "He's 23 now, studying at university. Brilliant boy, though he'd tell you I'm biased." "What's he studying?" "Theoretical physics. Wants to work on artificial intelligence someday, maybe contribute to medical applications." She paused, realizing the connection to Alexander's own work. He's always been fascinated by the possibility of technology helping people with disabilities. Something flickered across Alexander's face, too quick to identify. He turned back to his monitors without another word, but Grace noticed that his typing was less aggressive for the rest of the afternoon. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, during what should have been a routine Thursday morning. Grace was cleaning the bathroom when she heard a crash from the living room, followed by a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. She found Alexander beside his overturned wheelchair, surrounded by scattered papers and a broken coffee mug, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. He had been trying to reach a file from a high shelf when the chair had tipped forward, sending him tumbling to the floor. The same man who had once commanded boardrooms was now helpless on his own carpet, unable to right his wheelchair or clean up the mess he had created. "Don't," he said sharply when Grace moved to help. "Just don't." But Grace ignored his protest, kneeling beside him to check for injuries before carefully helping him back into his chair. Her movements were gentle but firm, professional in a way that suggested experience with this exact situation. She cleaned up the broken ceramic and scattered papers without fuss, restoring order to the room as if nothing had happened. When she was finished, Alexander was sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. Grace thought he might be crying, but when he looked up, his eyes were dry and blazing with fury. "Are you satisfied?" he demanded. "Is this what you wanted to see? The great Alexander Hartwell, helpless as a child, unable to function in his own home." Grace set down the dustpan and regarded him steadily. "I don't feel sorry for you," she said quietly. "And I don't think you're helpless, but I do think you're wasting what you have left." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Grace's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. "I've seen real helplessness, Mr. Hartwell. I've held my son through seizures that left him unable to speak for days. I've watched children in hospital wards fight for every breath while their parents prayed for just one more day together. You're not helpless. You're just angry. And anger is a choice." Alexander stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, as if he couldn't quite process what he had heard. "You have no idea what I've lost." "You're right," Grace agreed. "I don't know what it feels like to lose the life you planned, but I do know what it feels like to love someone enough to help them find a new one." She left him sitting there, speechless and shaken, while she finished her work in other parts of the apartment. When she was ready to leave that afternoon, she found him in the same position, staring out the window at the Thames below. "Same time tomorrow, Mr. Hartwell?" she asked. He nodded without turning around. That evening, for the first time since the accident, Alexander didn't dream about walking. Instead, he dreamed about a woman with calloused hands and gentle eyes, teaching a young man in a wheelchair how to navigate quantum equations on a whiteboard, both of them laughing at some private joke while rain fell against the windows of a modest flat somewhere in London. Over the following days, something subtle began to shift in their interactions. Alexander still didn't engage in lengthy conversations, but he began to notice things about Grace that he had previously overlooked. The way she hummed softly while working, always the same melody that seemed vaguely familiar. The careful way she arranged his books, not by size or color but by subject matter, as if she understood the logic of his thinking. The fact that she never used the expensive coffee in his kitchen, bringing her own tea bags instead, and making do with whatever was available. He found himself timing his movements through the apartment to coincide with her schedule, not to interact, but to observe. Grace worked with an efficiency that spoke of experience, but also with a care that went beyond mere professionalism. She treated his belongings as if they mattered, his space as if it deserved respect, regardless of how he treated her. One afternoon, while Grace was preparing to leave, Alexander surprised himself by asking, "The melody you hum, what is it?" Grace paused in gathering her cleaning supplies. "Oh, that. It's just an old lullaby my mother used to sing. Carrickfergus. Do you know it?" Alexander shook his head. "It's about longing," Grace said simply, "about being far from home and wanting to return to the people who matter most." She left him with those words, and Alexander spent the evening searching for the song online, listening to different versions, until he found one that matched the melody Grace hummed. The lyrics spoke of exile and sorrow, but also of hope and the possibility of return. He found himself wondering what home meant to Grace, what people she longed to return to, besides the son she had mentioned. It was during his third week that Alexander learned something that changed his perception of Grace entirely. She had arrived later than usual one morning, apologizing quietly for the delay. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her usually steady hands trembled slightly as she hung up her coat. "Everything all right?" Alexander found himself asking, surprising them both. Grace hesitated, as if debating whether to answer honestly. "I spent the night at the hospital," she said finally. "David had a seizure yesterday evening. They wanted to monitor him overnight." "Is he okay?" "He will be. This happens sometimes. The doctors say it's related to his cerebral palsy, but it's always frightening when it happens." Alexander felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in months. "You should have called, told the agency. They could have sent someone else." Grace looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "He's stable now, and this job is important to me." "Because of the money?" "Because of the hours," Grace said. "Most positions require full-time availability. This allows me to visit David regularly, to be there when he needs me." After that conversation, Alexander found himself researching cerebral palsy, reading about seizures and treatment options with the same intensity he had once applied to business problems. He learned about the challenges faced by families caring for disabled adults, about the funding cuts to public health services, about the daily battles fought by people whose struggles never made headlines. For the first time since his accident, Alexander was thinking about someone else's problems instead of wallowing in his own. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was real. Alexander began saying please when he asked for something, thank you when Grace brought his meals. He started leaving his door open while she worked, not exactly inviting conversation, but not actively discouraging it either. When she mentioned that David was struggling with a particular physics problem, Alexander found himself offering to look at it, explaining complex equations with the same patience he had once reserved for potential investors. Grace began to see glimpses of the man Alexander had been before the accident, flashes of the intelligence and charisma that had built an empire. But more importantly, she began to see the man he might become if he could learn to forgive himself for being human, for being vulnerable, for needing help. The afternoon that changed everything came without warning, as most transformative moments do. Alexander had been having a particularly difficult day, frustrated by a conference call where his former business partners had essentially ignored his input, treating him like an advisor rather than a founder. He had spent the afternoon alternating between fury and despair, snapping at Grace when she tried to bring him lunch, retreating to his study to brood over financial reports that no longer seemed to matter. Grace had worked around his mood all day, giving him space while quietly maintaining the routines that kept his life functioning. As evening approached, she was preparing to leave when she heard the unmistakable sound of something breaking. Not the crash of an accident this time, but the deliberate sound of destruction. She found Alexander in his living room, having swept everything from his coffee table onto the floor. Books, papers, electronics, and personal items lay scattered across the carpet, and Alexander was reaching for more things to destroy, his face contorted with a rage that seemed to be consuming him from within. "Mr. Hartwell," Grace said quietly, not moving closer but not backing away either. "Get out," he said without looking at her. "Just get out and leave me alone." Instead, Grace sat down on his couch, folding her hands in her lap and watching him calmly. No, she said. The simple word seemed to shock Alexander more than anything else could have. He stopped reaching for objects to throw and stared at her. What did you say? I said, no, I'm not leaving you like this. This is my home. I'm telling you to go. And I'm telling you that I've seen this before. Grace's voice was steady, compassionate, but firm. The rage, the self-destruction, the pushing away everyone who cares. My son went through exactly the same thing when he was 15, after his first major seizure. Left him hospitalized for a week. He was so angry at his body, at God, at me for bringing him into a world that seemed designed to hurt him. Alexander's hands slowly lowered to his lap. What did you do? I sat with him. Just like I'm sitting with you now. I waited for the storm to pass, and then I helped him clean up the mess, because that's what people do for each other. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The apartment was utterly quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic far below, and the soft ticking of the antique clock on Alexander's mantelpiece. Finally, Alexander's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I don't know how to be this person. I don't know how to be weak. You're not weak, Grace said gently. You're learning, and learning is the hardest thing any of us ever do. She stood up and began collecting the scattered items from the floor, not because it was her job, but because it needed to be done. After a moment, Alexander wheeled over to help, and together they restored order to the room, working in a companionable silence that felt like the beginning of something neither of them quite understood yet. The morning after Alexander's breakdown, Grace arrived to find him already awake, sitting by the massive windows that overlooked the Thames. The London skyline stretched before him, but he wasn't looking at the city. Instead, he was reading something on his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Good morning, Mr. Hartwell, Grace said softly, hanging her coat in the hall closet. Alexander, he said without looking up. Just Alexander. I think we're past formalities, don't you? It was such a simple statement, but Grace felt something shift in the air between them. For months, the title had been a barrier, a way for both of them to maintain professional distance. His casual abandonment of it felt like an invitation to something more genuine. What are you reading? She asked, moving to start her morning routine. Research on cerebral palsy treatments, specifically the newer approaches to managing seizures in adults. He finally looked up at her, and Grace was struck by how different his eyes seemed. The constant anger had been replaced by something she hadn't seen since her first day. Genuine interest in something outside his own suffering. For David, I thought perhaps I could help. I still have connections in the medical technology field, access to research that might not be widely available yet. Alexander paused, suddenly uncertain. If you think he would welcome the input. I know I'm hardly qualified to give medical advice, but sometimes a fresh perspective can be useful. Grace set down the cleaning supplies she had been carrying and looked at him fully. Alexander, that's incredibly kind of you. He shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair, as if kindness was a foreign concept he wasn't sure how to accept. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about learning. I realized I haven't tried to learn anything new since the accident. I've just been existing. Over the following days, their morning conversations became a cherished routine. Alexander would share what he had discovered in his research, and Grace would tell him about David's experiences, his struggles and triumphs. These talks revealed layers of both their personalities that had been hidden beneath the professional surface of their relationship. Grace learned that Alexander's drive for perfection came from his working-class background, a childhood spent watching his parents struggle to make ends meet while he excelled in school. His success hadn't been handed to him. It had been earned through countless hours of study, through scholarships and student loans, through a determination to never again experience the helplessness of poverty. I built my entire identity around being in control, he admitted one morning over coffee. When the accident happened, it didn't just take my legs. It took everything I thought I was. Grace understood this better than he might have expected. She had her own experiences with identity being shattered by circumstances beyond her control. It was during their third week of these morning conversations that Grace finally told him about the tragedy she had alluded to months earlier, the event that had changed the trajectory of her life. She had been a pediatric nurse at Great Ormond Street Hospital, working in the oncology ward with children battling cancer. It was demanding work, emotionally exhausting but deeply fulfilling. I loved those children, she said, her voice soft with memory. They were so brave, so full of life even when their bodies were failing them. There was this one little girl, Emma, 7 years old, with acute leukemia. She had been fighting for 2 years through chemotherapy, radiation, bone marrow transplants. Her parents had exhausted their savings, their hope, everything except their love for her. Alexander listened without interruption, sensing the weight of what Grace was about to share. Emma was responding well to a new experimental treatment. Her numbers were improving. Her energy was returning. We all thought we were witnessing a miracle. Her parents were planning a trip to Disneyland for when she got out of the hospital. Grace paused, her hands tightening around her teacup. But there was a mix-up with her medication. A new nurse, overwhelmed and undertrained, administered the wrong dosage of one of her drugs. It was a mistake that should have been caught by multiple safety protocols, but it wasn't. The silence in the apartment was profound. Alexander felt his own problems shrinking in the face of Grace's pain. Emma died that night, Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. And it was my fault. I was the senior nurse on duty. I should have double-checked the medication, should have been more vigilant, should have protected her better. Her parents trusted me with their most precious gift, and I failed them. Grace, Alexander said gently, that wasn't your fault. You said it yourself. There were supposed to be multiple safety protocols. The investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, Grace said. But knowing that doesn't make the guilt go away. I resigned the next day. I couldn't face another child, another set of parents who believed I could keep their babies safe when I had proven I couldn't. Alexander reached across the small table they were sitting at and covered Grace's hand with his own. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact with anyone since his accident, and the gesture surprised them both. "Is that why you became a housekeeper?" he asked. Grace nodded. "I needed work that couldn't hurt anyone. Something simple, uncomplicated, where the worst mistake I could make was missing a spot on a mirror." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "But David needed me to be strong, to be his advocate in a world that doesn't always understand disability. I couldn't fall apart completely." "You never fell apart," Alexander said with quiet conviction. "You found another way to take care of people. You've been taking care of me even when I didn't want to be cared for." Their conversation was interrupted by Alexander's phone ringing. It was his mother, Margaret, calling with her weekly check-in. These conversations had become stilted and painful since the accident, with his parents struggling to find safe topics that wouldn't trigger his anger or depression. But today, something was different. "Hello, Mum," Alexander answered, and Grace was surprised by the warmth in his voice. "Oh, Alexander, darling, how are you feeling this week?" "Better," he said, and Grace could hear the surprise in his own voice, as if he hadn't realized it was true until he said it. "Actually, I've been doing some research into medical technology applications. Remember how I used to talk about using AI to improve patient care? I think I might want to revisit that area." The joy in Margaret Hartwell's voice was audible even from across the room. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. Your father will be so pleased to hear you're thinking about work again." After the call ended, Alexander sat quietly for a moment, processing what he had just said. "I think I meant that," he told Grace, "about wanting to work on medical applications again. What's stopping you?" Alexander laughed, but it wasn't bitter. "Pride, mostly. My former partners made it clear they don't need my input anymore. I'd have to start over, build something new, and I'm not sure I remember how to do that from a wheelchair." "The wheelchair doesn't change your mind," Grace said simply. "It just changes how you move through the world." That afternoon, Alexander made a phone call that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. He contacted Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a neurologist he had met during his search for experimental treatments. Dr. Mitchell had mentioned a research project he was developing, something about using AI to predict and prevent seizures in patients with epilepsy and cerebral palsy. "Alexander!" Dr. Mitchell's voice was warm with surprise. "I've been hoping to hear from you. How are you managing?" "I'm learning," Alexander said, glancing at Grace as she worked quietly in the background. "You mentioned a research project a few months ago, something about predictive algorithms for seizure management. Is that still ongoing?" "Very much so. We're struggling with the computational aspects, actually. The patterns are incredibly complex, and we need someone with your background to help us develop the algorithms." For the first time since his accident, Alexander felt the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge. "I'd like to help, if you'll have me." "Have you?" "Alexander, We'd be honored to work with you. After ending the call, Alexander found himself energized in a way he hadn't experienced in months. He spent the afternoon researching Dr. Mitchell's work, diving into medical journals and technical papers with an enthusiasm that reminded Grace of David when he discovered a new area of physics to explore. As the days passed, Alexander threw himself into the project with increasing passion. He set up video conferences with Dr. Mitchell's team, contributed to algorithm development, and began to feel useful again. More importantly, he began to understand that his value didn't come from his ability to walk or command a boardroom, but from his mind and his capacity to solve problems that could help people. The first major breakthrough came 3 weeks into his collaboration with Dr. Mitchell's team. They had developed a preliminary algorithm that could predict seizures up to 30 minutes before they occurred in about 60% of test cases. It wasn't perfect, but it was promising enough to attract interest from several major medical technology companies. "This could change everything for families like yours," Alexander told Grace excitedly as he showed her the test results on his computer. "Imagine if David could get a warning before a seizure hits, enough time to get somewhere safe, to call for help, to take preventive medication." Grace looked at the screen, not entirely understanding the technical details, but recognizing the passion in Alexander's voice. "You're helping people again," she said softly. "We're helping people," Alexander corrected. "I never would have thought to work on this if it weren't for meeting David, for understanding what families like yours go through every day." It was around this time that Victoria called. Alexander was in his study, working on code refinements for the seizure prediction algorithm, when his phone rang with her familiar number. He stared at the screen for several rings before answering. "Hello, Victoria." "Alex?" Her voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the tension underneath. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I've been thinking about you lately." "How are you?" Alexander asked politely, surprised by his own lack of emotional reaction to hearing from her. "I'm well, engaged actually, to Jonathan Pemberton. You remember him from the yacht club?" Alexander did remember him. A pleasant enough man, wealthy but unremarkable, the kind of person who would provide Victoria with the stable, uncomplicated life she had always wanted. "Congratulations," Alexander said, and meant it. "I wanted to tell you myself before you heard it from someone else. And I wanted to apologize for how things ended between us. I wasn't strong enough to handle what happened to you, and I'm sorry for that." Alexander considered her words carefully. 6 months ago, this conversation would have devastated him. Now, he felt only a mild sadness for what they had both lost. "You don't need to apologize, Victoria. We both did the best we could with an impossible situation." "You sound different," she said softly. "Better. Are you happy?" Alexander glanced through his study door to where Grace was arranging flowers in a vase, humming her Irish lullaby as she worked. "I'm learning to be," he said. After the call ended, Alexander realized something had fundamentally shifted. Victoria's engagement didn't hurt because he no longer needed her approval to feel worthy. His identity was no longer tied to being the man she had fallen in love with, or the man his business partners had once respected. He was becoming someone new, someone he was actually starting to like. That evening, Grace noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Good news?" she asked, nodding toward his phone. "In a way," Alexander said. "Victoria called to tell me she's engaged." Grace paused in her work, searching his face for signs of distress. "How do you feel about that?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "Free," he said finally. "For the first time since the accident, I feel free." The breakthrough in their personal relationship came unexpectedly, during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening. Grace had stayed late to help Alexander prepare for a presentation to Dr. Mitchell's research team, formatting slides and organizing data. They had ordered Chinese takeaway and were eating in his study, surrounded by papers and laptop computers, when Grace made an observation that stopped Alexander in his tracks. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "David always says that his disability taught him to see the world differently, to notice things that others miss. Maybe your accident did the same thing for you." Alexander looked up from his food. "What do you mean?" "Before, you were so focused on climbing higher, moving faster, staying ahead of everyone else. But now you're looking at problems from a completely different angle. This seizure prediction work, It's not about profit or prestige. It's about making life better for people who have been forgotten by most of society. Alexander felt something click into place, a piece of the puzzle he hadn't even realized was missing. I never thought about it that way. David calls it the gift of perspective, Grace continued. He says his cerebral palsy forced him to slow down, to think more carefully about each step he takes. It made him a better student, a more compassionate person, a deeper thinker. And you think my accident might have done something similar? Grace smiled, and Alexander was struck by how beautiful she looked in the soft light from his desk lamp, her face animated with the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving real hardship. I think, she said carefully, that sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted in order to discover what we actually need. That night, after Grace had gone home, Alexander sat by his window, looking out at the city lights, and thought about the man he had been before the accident. Successful, yes, wealthy, certainly. But had he been happy? Had he been making a difference in the world beyond accumulating wealth and status? For the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted his old life back, even if that were possible. The man he was becoming, this version of Alexander Hartwell who worked on projects that mattered, who had learned to value kindness over conquest, who could find joy in small moments of connection with another human being, this man seemed worth being. As he prepared for bed that night, Alexander made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He was ready to stop hiding from the world. He was ready to let people see not just his disability, but his strength. And most importantly, he was ready to acknowledge the debt he owed to the quiet, remarkable woman who had refused to give up on him when he had given up on himself. Spring arrived in London with an unusual warmth that seemed to breathe new life into everything it touched. The cherry trees along the Thames were blooming earlier than expected, and even the city's notorious grey clouds seemed lighter, more forgiving. For Alexander, the changing season felt like a mirror of his own transformation, a visible reminder that renewal was always possible, even after the harshest winter. Dr. Mitchell's seizure prediction project had evolved far beyond their initial hopes. The algorithm they had developed was now successfully predicting seizures in 85% of test cases, with a lead time that had expanded to nearly an hour in optimal conditions. 3 major pharmaceutical companies were competing to license the technology, and preliminary trials were beginning at hospitals across Europe. But for Alexander, the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Grace had arranged for him to meet David, her son, at a small cafe near University College London, where David was completing his physics degree. Alexander had been nervous about the meeting, unsure how to interact with someone whose challenges he had studied academically but never experienced personally. David Murphy was nothing like Alexander had expected. Where Alexander had imagined fragility, he found strength. Where he had anticipated limitation, he discovered boundless curiosity. David moved through the world with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate obstacles through intelligence rather than force. But there was nothing hesitant about his mind. "Mum's told me so much about you," David said, his speech slightly slurred but perfectly comprehensible. "She says you're working on seizure prediction algorithms." "With your mother's inspiration," Alexander replied. "She helped me understand what families like yours go through." David smiled, and Alexander was struck by how much he resembled Grace, not in features, but in the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from both of them. "She has a gift for helping people see beyond their limitations. She's done it for me my whole life." They spent the afternoon discussing the technical aspects of the project, with David offering insights that came from living with the daily reality of unpredictable seizures. His questions were sharp, his understanding of the implications profound, and Alexander found himself energized by the conversation in a way that reminded him why he had fallen in love with problem-solving in the first place. "You know," David said as they were preparing to leave, "Mum never talks about her work, but I can tell you've been good for her too. She's been different these past few months, lighter somehow." Alexander looked across the cafe to where Grace was paying for their coffee, and he saw what David meant. There was something different about her posture, her expression, as if a burden she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. On the drive home, Grace was quieter than usual, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who no longer need to fill every moment with words. "David's remarkable," Alexander said finally. "He is." Grace agreed. But then, so are you. The comment surprised Alexander. In all their months of working together, Grace had never directly praised him, never tried to boost his ego or make him feel better about his situation. Her acknowledgement now felt earned in a way that external validation never had. "I've been thinking about something," Alexander said, as they pulled into the underground garage of his building. "The seizure prediction project is going to need a patient advocate, someone who understands the real-world implications of what we're developing, someone who has lived with these challenges." Grace turned to look at him, sensing there was more to come. "I'd like David to be part of the team if he's interested, not as a patient or test subject, but as a consultant, a voice for the community we're trying to serve." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "He would be honored. And so am I." The decision to go public with his story came gradually, then all at once. Alexander had been content to work behind the scenes, contributing to Dr. Mitchell's research while avoiding the spotlight that had once been such a crucial part of his identity. But as the seizure prediction technology moved closer to commercial application, he realized that his visibility could serve a purpose beyond his own ego. The opportunity came through an invitation to speak at the Global Health Innovation Summit in London, a prestigious gathering of researchers, policymakers, and healthcare advocates. Dr. Mitchell had been invited to present their work, and he suggested that Alexander join him on stage to discuss the technical development process. Alexander's first instinct was to decline. The idea of appearing in public, in his wheelchair in front of an audience that might remember the man he used to be, filled him with a familiar anxiety. But Grace, as she so often did, helped him see the situation from a different perspective. "Think about all the people out there who are where you were 6 months ago," she said, as they discussed the invitation over morning coffee. "People who think their lives are over because their bodies have changed. People who believe they have nothing left to contribute to the world. What if I'm not ready? What if I say the wrong thing?" Grace set down her cup and looked at him directly. "Alexander, you've spent months developing technology that could prevent thousands of people from experiencing the terror and helplessness of unexpected seizures. You've created something that will give families hope and patients control over their own lives. If you're not ready to talk about that, then none of us ever will be." The summit was held at the Royal Institution, a venue steeped in the history of scientific discovery. As Alexander was wheeled onto the stage, he felt the familiar flutter of pre-presentation nerves, but underneath it was something new, a deep confidence that came not from his ability to impress others, but from knowing that his work mattered. Dr. Mitchell spoke first, outlining the technical specifications of their seizure prediction algorithm and presenting the data from their clinical trials. The audience, composed of healthcare professionals and technology experts, was clearly impressed by the results, but their attention was polite, professional, academic. Then Alexander began to speak, and something in the room shifted. 18 months ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "I was a different person, successful, driven, convinced that I had life figured out. I measured my worth by my achievements, my status, my ability to control every variable in my environment. And then, in a single moment, all of that changed." He paused, looking out at the audience, seeing not potential investors or professional colleagues, but human beings who had their own struggles, their own moments of vulnerability. "The accident that put me in this wheelchair didn't just change how I move through the world. It changed how I see the world. For the first time in my adult life, I understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to be dependent on others, to face a future that looked nothing like the one I had planned." Alexander glanced toward the side of the stage, where Grace stood with Dr. Mitchell's team, her presence a steady anchor in his peripheral vision. "I spent months believing that my life was over, that because I couldn't walk, I couldn't contribute anything meaningful to society. It took a remarkable woman, someone whose name you won't find in business magazines or technology journals, to help me understand that walking is about much more than moving your legs. Walking is about knowing where you're going and why it matters." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "The seizure prediction technology we've developed didn't come from my previous expertise in artificial intelligence, though that was certainly useful. It came from learning about the daily reality faced by families like that of Grace Murphy, whose son David lives with cerebral palsy and unpredictable seizures. It came from understanding that the most important innovations aren't always the ones that make the most money or generate the most headlines. They're the ones that give people back a sense of control over their own lives. Alexander went on to describe the technical aspects of their work, but he framed it in terms of human impact rather than computational achievement. He talked about David, about the fear that seizure patients and their families live with every day, about the possibility of technology serving not just efficiency or profit, but genuine human need. When he finished speaking, the applause was different from any he had received in his previous life. It wasn't the polite appreciation of business colleagues or the enthusiastic response of investors sensing opportunity. It was the recognition of shared humanity, the acknowledgement that he had offered something real and valuable to the world. During the reception that followed, Alexander found himself surrounded by people who wanted to know more about the project, about his story, about his transformation from tech entrepreneur to healthcare advocate. But the conversation that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb, his former business partner, approached him hesitantly, clearly unsure of his reception. "Alex," Marcus said, extending his hand, That was extraordinary. I had no idea you were working on something like this." Alexander shook his hand, noting how strange it felt to be looking up at someone who had once been his equal in every business meeting. "Hello, Marcus, how are things at Neural Dynamics?" "Profitable," Marcus said with a slight grimace, "but not particularly meaningful, if I'm honest. We're doing well, but we're not changing lives the way you are now." "Different paths," Alexander said simply. "I'm not the same person who founded that company." "No," Marcus agreed. "You're better. The man I worked with for 5 years was brilliant, but he was also ruthless, single-minded, sometimes cruel in his ambition. This version of you, the man I just watched speak about using technology to serve humanity rather than dominate it. This is who you were supposed to become." After the reception, Alexander and Grace drove home through the London evening, both of them processing what had happened. The speech had been a success beyond Alexander's wildest expectations, but more importantly, it had felt authentic, purposeful, like the first public act of the man he was becoming, rather than a performance by the man he used to be. "I'm proud of you," Grace said, as they entered his apartment. "I couldn't have done it without you," Alexander replied. "Not just today, but any of this. The research, the perspective, the courage to believe I still had something to offer the world." Grace was quiet for a moment, and Alexander sensed she was struggling with something. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally. "I've been offered another position." Alexander felt his stomach drop. "Where?" "Back at Great Ormond Street Hospital. They're starting a new program for families of children with neurological conditions, and they want me to help design it. It would mean using everything I learned as a nurse, but also everything I've learned as a mother, as someone who has navigated the healthcare system from the other side." Alexander absorbed this news, recognizing both the incredible opportunity it represented for Grace and the profound loss it would mean for him. "It's perfect for you," he said, meaning it despite his own feelings. "When would you start?" "Next month, if I accept it." Grace looked at him carefully. "The question is whether you still need me here." Alexander considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he would have panicked at the idea of Grace leaving, would have offered her more money, better conditions, anything to keep her from abandoning him, as so many others had. But the man he had become understood that true care sometimes meant letting people go. "I'll always need you," he said honestly, "but not in the way I did when we first met. You helped me become someone who can take care of himself, someone who can contribute to the world again. The best way I can honor that gift is to encourage you to do the same." Grace smiled, and Alexander realized it was the first time he had seen her look completely, unreservedly happy. "There's something else," she said. "The hospital position comes with family health insurance that would allow me to move David to a private care facility, one that specializes in adults with cerebral palsy. He'd have access to better therapy, more independence, and I'd be able to visit him every day instead of just weekends." "Grace, that's wonderful. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before I gave them my answer." Alexander reached out and took her hand, the gesture as natural now as it had once been foreign. "You've given me my life back," he said. "Now go live yours." Grace's last day working for Alexander fell on a brilliant Thursday in May. She arrived, as always, at 7 in the morning, but instead of her usual cleaning supplies, she brought a small wrapped package. "A going-away gift?" Alexander asked, accepting the package with curiosity. "More like a reminder," Grace said. Inside was a small framed photograph of David at his university graduation ceremony, which had taken place the week before. He was wearing his cap and gown, his face radiant with achievement. But what struck Alexander most was the caption Grace had written below the image. "To Alexander, who taught me that helping people achieve their dreams is the most important work any of us can do. With love and gratitude, Grace." "He graduated with first-class honors," Grace said, "and he's been accepted to a graduate program in medical physics. He wants to work on the kind of technology you've been developing." "He'll be brilliant at it," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. They spent the morning not working, but talking, sharing stories and memories from their months together. Grace told him about her plans for the hospital program, her hopes for David's future, her excitement about returning to healthcare. Alexander told her about his expanding research collaborations, about the book he was thinking of writing, about his growing sense that his best years might still be ahead of him. As afternoon approached, it was time for Grace to leave. She gathered her few personal belongings from the apartment, taking with her the small things that had made the space feel like home: her tea bags, her reading glasses, the cardigan she kept in the hall closet for chilly mornings. At the door they embraced, and Alexander was struck by how much their relationship had changed from those first tense days when they could barely make eye contact. "I'll miss you," he said simply. "I'll miss you too," Grace replied, "but this isn't goodbye. David and I will always be part of your story, just as you'll always be part of ours." After she left, Alexander sat alone in his apartment for the first time in months, but he didn't feel lonely. The space around him was full of the changes Grace had helped him make, not just in the physical environment, but in his entire approach to living. Her influence was in the research papers scattered across his desk, in the wheelchair-accessible modifications he had made to the apartment, in the framed photograph of David that now sat prominently on his mantelpiece. That evening, Alexander called his parents to tell them about Grace's departure and to share some news of his own. "Mum, Dad, I wanted you to know that I've decided to sell the penthouse." "Oh, Alexander," his mother said, concern evident in her voice. "Are you sure it's such a beautiful place?" "It is," Alexander agreed, "but it was designed for a different version of me. I'm looking at a house in Richmond near the river. Single story, but with a garden and space for a proper home office. Somewhere I can host David when he visits, somewhere you can stay when you come to London." "That sounds wonderful, son," his father said, and Alexander could hear the relief in his voice. For months, Harold Hartwell had been watching his son retreat from the world, and this decision to create a true home, rather than a fortress, felt like a return to life. 3 months later, Alexander stood in the garden of his new home, watching as caterers set up tables for the celebration he was hosting. The seizure prediction algorithm had received final approval for clinical use, and the first devices would be available to patients within 6 months. Dr. Mitchell and his team were there, along with David and Grace, several other researchers, and dozens of patients and families who had participated in the trials. The garden was accessible and beautiful, with raised flower beds that Alexander could tend from his wheelchair and pathways wide enough for anyone to navigate comfortably. It was a space designed not just for his needs, but for the needs of anyone who might visit, a physical manifestation of the inclusive philosophy that now guided his work. As the sun began to set over the Thames, Alexander called for everyone's attention. He had prepared remarks, but looking out at the faces before him, friends and colleagues and families whose lives had been touched by their work, he decided to speak from the heart instead. 18 months ago, I thought my life was over," he began, his voice carrying across the garden. "I had built my identity around things that could be taken away in an instant: physical ability, professional status, other people's admiration. When I lost those things, I believed I had lost everything that mattered." He paused, his eyes finding Grace in the crowd, standing next to David, both of them smiling at him with the kind of pride that comes from shared struggle and mutual respect. "I was wrong. What I actually lost was my illusions. What I gained was something far more valuable, the understanding that true strength comes not from what we can control, but from how we respond to what we cannot control. True success is measured not by how high we climb, but by how many people we help along the way." The applause was warm and sustained, but Alexander raised his hand for quiet. He wasn't finished. The technology we're celebrating today exists because a remarkable woman refused to give up on a broken man who had given up on himself. Grace Murphy taught me that walking isn't about moving your legs. Walking is about knowing where you're going and why it matters. It's about understanding that every step forward, no matter how small, no matter how difficult, is an act of faith in the possibility of something better. He looked directly at Grace, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Grace, you gave me back my ability to walk, not through medicine or technology, but through the simple revolutionary act of believing I was worth saving. And David, you showed me that brilliance and strength come in many forms, that limitations can become sources of wisdom, that the most important discoveries often come from the most unexpected places. The celebration continued late into the evening, with conversations flowing between researchers and patients, families sharing stories, and new collaborations being born. But the moment that Alexander would remember most vividly came near the end of the night, when Grace approached him as he sat watching the Thames flow past his garden. "You know," she said, settling into the chair beside him, "when I first started working for you, I thought my job was to clean your house and stay out of your way." "What do you think your job was, really?" Alexander asked. Grace smiled, that same gentle, knowing expression he had come to treasure. "To remind you that you were still alive, still capable of growth, still worthy of love and connection. To hold space for the man you were becoming, while the man you had been finished dying. And what do you think my job was? To remind me that helping others doesn't always require a medical degree or a hospital badge. Sometimes it just requires showing up, staying present, and believing in someone's capacity for transformation even when they don't believe in it themselves." As the last guests departed and the catering staff finished cleaning up, Alexander and Grace sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights of London twinkle across the water. Tomorrow, Grace would return to her work at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and Alexander would continue his research collaborations. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found their way back to themselves through the miracle of genuine human connection. Alexander thought about the man he had been before the accident, so focused on destination that he had forgotten the importance of the journey. He thought about the months of darkness and despair, when walking seemed like the only thing that mattered. And he thought about the gradual, sometimes painful process of discovering that the most important journey anyone can take is not measured in steps, but in the growing capacity to love without conditions, to serve without recognition, and to find meaning not in what we accomplish alone, but in what we build together. The seizure prediction technology would go on to help thousands of patients around the world, giving families the gift of preparation and control in the face of unpredictable medical challenges. Alexander's story would be told in medical conferences and technology journals, inspiring other researchers to consider the human impact of their innovations. Grace's program at Great Ormond Street Hospital would become a model for family-centered care, helping parents and siblings navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of childhood neurological conditions. But the real victory, the one that mattered most to both of them, was quieter and more personal. The recognition that no one rebuilds their life alone, that the most profound transformations happen not through individual heroism, but through the patient, loving work of connection, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is the simple, revolutionary act of seeing their potential when they can no longer see it themselves. As Grace prepared to leave that night, she paused at the garden gate and looked back at Alexander, who was still sitting by the river, his face peaceful in the moonlight. "Thank you," she called softly. "Thank you," he called back. And in that exchange, they both understood that they were not thanking each other for services rendered or favors granted, but for something far more precious: the gift of mutual transformation, the recognition that they had been exactly what each other needed at exactly the right moment, and the knowledge that their connection would endure not because of what they had shared, but because of who they had helped each other become.